Just about every day on either social media or some other channel, there's all kinds of leaders that I get stuff from, so-called leaders, about all the perks of leadership. The cars you could get, the money you can make, the houses you could potentially buy. And look, don't get me wrong, none of those things in and of themselves are bad. But it's interesting that these so-called leaders on social, on TV, and so forth, they never really create other leaders that have success leading large teams. It's like their success ends with them because of their focus on perks. You know, if you didn't see the last edition of P3, our video, this is where I started to talk about the difference or the shift that as leaders, in order to be truly successful, what we need to do is shift from this idea of perks to the price of leadership. Let's face it, perks is all about what's in it for me. Price is what can I do for you. Perks, as I described in the last video, is, you know, what are you going to give me to play the game, where price is really about what am I willing to give to win the game. And we started to look through, I started to lay out kind of what does this really mean in the real world. And one of the first things we looked at is we've got to come to grips with the reality of the price of leadership, right? Anything of value, as I talked about last time, actually is an uphill battle. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes money. And then I introduced the idea, the second piece to this is as leaders, we need to be climbing the hill first before our teams, right? We need to be the ones actually setting the example. But the question that comes out of that is, what does that really mean? How does that play out in real life? You know, being a leader, it's easy when times are good to get people to follow you. The real challenge is when things aren't going so well and ultimately there's a cycle and they won't, how do you really create that environment where people will follow you? That's what getting to the hill first is all about. But there's really three characteristics if you think about a follow me type of leader, where we say follow us up the hill. And the first characteristic is pretty simple actually. These follow me type leaders have faith in themselves more and before anyone else does. Now that seems kind of weird, but let's play this out here for a second, right? Leaders that I've met a ton of successful leaders that the people around them, not all of their people, had faith and trust in them. But I've never met a successful leader that didn't have faith in themselves. Paul Harvey said it the best. There's this quote that I attribute back to him. It's, you can't live it if you don't have it. If you don't have faith in yourself, people are never going to have faith in you in the first place. There's a story I like to tell on this, and this is an attorney. This is a true story. There's a defense attorney that was defending a supposed murderer that had murdered a lady, but the lady was never found, the murder weapon was never found. But everybody kind of knew that this guy was guilty, at least that was the assumption. But one day in court, the lawyer actually stood up in front of the jurors and said, here's what's going to happen. In 1 minute, that door on the other end of the courtroom, the supposed victim is going to walk through that door, sits back down. Everybody's looking at their watch. All the jurors move their head, and they're now looking at that door in anticipation of the door opening. Well, 58 seconds, 59 seconds, 60 seconds, and of course the door never opened. Everybody looks back at the attorney and the defendant, and the attorney gets back up and he says, you were all looking at that door because there's reasonable doubt that that individual, that supposed person that's dead, is going to walk through that door. So based on that, you have to say that my defendant, my client, is actually not guilty. Sits back down. The judge instructs the jurors to go back into the room and come up with a verdict, and a few minutes later they come back out. And it's interesting because they found the guy guilty. Well, the attorney went to the jury foreman and said, I don't understand it. There's reasonable doubt. You were all looking towards the door, waiting for the supposed dead person to come back in. That's enough reasonable doubt. And the jury foreman looks at the attorney and says, but we were also watching you and the defendant, and neither one of you ever looked because you knew nobody was coming in there. There's no reason for us to have faith in you if you didn't have faith in what you said yourself. So number one characteristic of follow me leaders is that we have to have faith in ourselves before and more than everybody else, so they'll ultimately follow suit. Number two is a little bit different. Characteristic number two is we have to set expectations before and more than everybody else on ourselves as leaders. So we set the tone for the people that are around us, that we work with, that work for us, and so on. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, a longtime client of mine was the CHRO for a large advertising organization. And one of the organizations that I had was doing a fair amount of work. And we did okay work. I wouldn't say it was superstar work by any stretch of the imagination. And I picked up the phone and I called her one day. Her name is Carolyn. And I said, Carolyn, I'm not happy where we are. My expectation is not to just meet expectations, but my expectation was actually to exceed expectations, and we didn't do that. What we're going to do is these different things in order to make up for that. Well, needless to say, Carolyn was blown away. She wasn't expecting it because we were meeting expectations. But my expectations on my delivery and the delivery of my team secondarily, because I was doing some of the work, was much higher than those around me. So when we really look at follow me leaders, those that get people to follow, we have to set our expectations of ourselves before and more than everybody else. And it's then and only then that they'll follow us when times are rough. The third characteristic is that we have to make sure that we create commitments or make commitments before and more than everybody else on ourselves. Integrity is not something that a lot of times you see because it's what happens when people aren't looking. The decisions we make when nobody else sees the impact of that decision, although it's not seen visually, the impacts of that are seen well after. There's a story of Abraham Lincoln, and I guess this is true, I'm not sure, it was told to me some years ago, and nobody thought Abe was actually going to win the presidency, and he didn't want it for himself. This came out many years later. He wanted it, before he died obviously, but he wanted the position of presidency to pull the people together. That was his focus. And shortly after he won president, he said, look, this wasn't about me then. It's not going to change now because I'm president. I'm paraphrasing. But he had made a commitment to himself to uphold the integrity of the decision that he made to run. It had nothing to do with the title. It had nothing to do with the perks. It had to do with the commitment he had made to actually make a difference. Look, in order to be the first one up the hill, to be that type of leader, we have to understand three pieces to this. We have to know when to get on that hill first and say, follow me along this path. We've got to figure out when to get alongside of somebody and encourage them along the path. And ultimately, we need to know how to get behind them and push them so that they can travel along the path. But in order to do that, we have already had to have been walking up that path in the first place. So that's really characteristic number two that I opened up with last time. Number three that we looked at in terms of the leader shift from perks to price was this idea of consistency. And I glossed over it very quickly in the last video, but I want to give you the four characteristics of what consistency in order to create that leadership is. And they're really simple, but this is so important to understand in your leadership journey. And so let's go through the four of them. Number one is this idea that consistency creates security for those around you. When as leaders we're consistent, we execute on what we say, we're consistent in our delivery of whatever that particular item might be, whether it's in the way we talk and the way we deliver the service and making commitments and following through. But that consistency creates a certain amount of comfort for those that report to you, for those that are on your team, for those that see exactly what it is that you're doing. So consistency creates security. The second thing about consistency is that it creates your reputation. How many times have you seen a one-hit wonder, whether it's in music or an athlete? Think about it. There's all these one hit, you heard the song, you know the song, but it's the only song that that particular artist has ever put out. You don't remember the artist because there's no reputation there at all. Consistency breeds that reputation. Sports athletes that have a phenomenal 1 year and you never see them again because there wasn't consistency. There was a few breakout moments which are great, but without consistency, people forget about you. People end up not following you. The third characteristic of this idea of consistency, and I mentioned this in the last video as well, is consistency compounds. And everybody knows I'm a baseball fan, or if you don't know, I'm a baseball fan. Cal Ripken Jr. is a name that almost everybody knows. He didn't have a great batting average. He actually wasn't a great baseball player in terms of being a fielder or any of those stats. But he consistently started in 2,632 games, which broke Lou Gehrig's record that had been set for 40 years. And as a result of that consistency, ended up in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So although it may not be the sexiest thing to be consistent, the reality of it is that consistency compounds itself and the results are a heck of a lot more than just mundane results. They could be spectacular. And then the last characteristic about consistency, and again, I mentioned this before, is this idea that consistency is not sexy. It's not fun in many instances. Take Tiger Woods, for example. Tiger Woods is notorious for practicing over and over and over again in the off season and in season. How many thousands of chips, how many thousands of drives that really at that point in practice mean nothing except creating the consistency so when it's time to go out and play, he plays really well. Now, unfortunately, he's not always played well, but he seems to be coming back again. Practicing is not sexy. Trying again is not sexy. Trying over and over and over is not sexy, but we see that in athletes or anybody that does things really well, is that doing them over and over and the consistency of the game ultimately creates that success that they have. In order to make that shift from focusing on perks and moving all the way to focusing on price, let's just recap this here for a second. We have to understand that anything of value is uphill. We have to make that connection first. The second thing is we have to set the example for our teams and be on that hill first and show them the path. And then the third and final thing is we have to keep climbing the hill. We can't stop. It's not time to give up. It's time to keep showing the way so your team will ultimately follow you. If you're serious, I mean really serious, about making the shift and creating more leaders on your team, it's time to move from the focus on perks to the focus on price. You won't regret it, and from what I've learned, I'm not regretting it either.